Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Kevin. Kevin, for everyone out there listening who might not know who you are, would you please like to introduce yourself to everybody out there listening?
Yeah, hi. My name's Kevin LaGrandeur. I'm a PhD, a professor, and have been working at NYIT, New York Institute of Technology. I also am a fellow of a think tank called the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technology, and I am one of the founders of a group here in New York City called the NY Posthuman Research Group. Posthuman meaning posthuman is the state that people who want to modify our bodies with technology think that we'll reach and actually become a separate species eventually. So the move toward incorporating more and more technology into ourselves is called the posthuman. So we study, my group in New York sort of focuses on what that kind of eventuality is causing, what it means, and what it could lead to. So that's what I do. I publish a lot on that stuff. I have a couple books. One is called Surviving the Machine Age. I put it together with a sociologist named James Hughes. That's mostly about economics, what's happening to jobs because of AI. And then the other book's called Artificial Slaves. And it's kind of a history of AI and how humans have used it all the way back to ancient times, all the way back to Aristotle. So believe it or not, Aristotle actually contemplated artificial intelligence, what we would call artificial intelligence. So that's what I do.
So it's not a new topic, but I think with ethics is kind of where I start to fall in is whenever I talk to someone who's involved in these technology ideas or these advancements of I tend to think about the worst possible scenarios or the way that it can be used for the worst possible things. Not saying I have a low regard for people. I just want to make sure that we're being very cautious in our steps forward. Because, I mean, if you could really examine where the main problems would be, like we were talking off air about data issues with people's devices, website companies, I picture AI or the power of AI is immense. Using it for environmental reasons is good, being able to predict possible ways to reduce carbon emissions and things of that sort. But then you land in this area of like, yeah, but who's going to have it first? And who's going to have it first is going to be those corporations. It's going to be these types of things. And then we land in like the really super far out category where people want to put it in their bodies. And I'm like, look, we gotta like manage at scale here, people. So let's take it back a step and let's figure out the goods that we can do with it, but be also very cautious of the bads as well, too.
Yeah, well, luckily we already have protections for medical devices. I mean, we already have a lot of technology in our bodies. Basically, a lot of people are already cyborgs. The people who have implantable defibrillators or pacemakers, for instance, or somebody who's deaf who has implanted cochlea, artificial cochlea, they all are cyborgic, and those things can be really helpful, especially if you have a bad heart. And those devices are carefully tracked, with digital numbers and all kinds of other things, and the communications between your implanted pacemaker and your physician are highly guarded. So that's good. But I think the problem is that AI is developing so rapidly that it's hard to keep up with all of it, and so some of the stuff is flying off the shelves without any kind of oversight. A good example, and the problem really is rogue operators and rogue governments. And I hate to say this, but China's one of them. China is not as concerned about privacy and personal, data as other countries are. For instance, they're using facial recognition to track the Uyghur population, the minority population there. Also, though, here's one most people don't know about. according to the South China Morning Post, um, some companies in China are forcing their employees to wear sensor caps at work, and then it reads their brain waves and transmits those to a central office where the bosses run them through an AI, and that AI regulates the workforce by analyzing the brain signals of all of the people on an assembly line. Hangzhou Zhongheng Electric Company is one of the companies that does this, and they have these sensor caps send information to the central computer, and then the AI sends back instructions to automatically slow down or speed up workflows, adjust break times, all these other things. And it's kind of scary. I mean, they claim, well, it's a safety protocol, right? It makes factory work safer. They also put their engineers that drive trains have these on their heads. And okay, so it may be more efficient and more safe in some ways, but those employees have, how much consent do they give for that? How much privacy do they have? How much right to that data do they have? As far as I can tell from reading the articles from Chinese newspapers, they don't have any. It's all covered by the bosses and controlled by them.
That's one of the biggest points I brought up when I was speaking with someone about fully autonomous vehicles. And he was saying it was going to be 50, 60 years down the line. And I was like, I don't think it's going to be that far. But I go, who would own the software that's programmed into all these vehicles? And he goes, well, it'd be company or government regulated. And I go, yeah, but what stops them from not letting you leave your house? You know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying that's what's going to happen. I know people go, that's conspiracy talk, but it's really about the sales pitch. Like that idea that China is an authoritarian government and they can do that over there and we know about it and we say it's horrible. But it's like, yeah, but it could happen over here too. It's just about how they sales pitch it. If they're able to tell you that you can put a sensory cap on your head and it'll be able to direct a whole train system, one person for multiple different trains, it's going to be sales pitched the correct way, but they don't tell you the other parts that go with it, like the effect of we'll be doing this or we'll be tracking your information, we'll be monitoring this or monitoring that, because they're already giving you the prize first. It's kind of like how I've always been about information in general, which is show me both hands, the one with the pile of crap in it and also the $1 million, and I'll make my decision.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, um, there are some safeguards, and I think that eventually government bodies and corporations will eventually do the right thing. I mean, look what we've done with nuclear energy regulation. We've regulated nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. Um, Maybe not perfectly, but it's good enough to not have blown ourselves to smithereens in the last 80 years. So, if we can do it with that, we can do it with AI as well. It's just we have to have the will to do it. And of course, people who make and utilize AI may resist having regulation because businesses don't like regulation because it slows things down and it makes things more of a hassle for them. But, you know, they do it if they're forced to. And there's been some good coupling, they businesses, some of them see the need for this as well. For instance, I was just reading this morning about a private a coupling of private and public agencies at the NIST, which it's the National Institute for Standards and Technology here in the United States, to make regulation of some new AI for businesses are putting out. So they're cooperating to do that. That's great. And I've just been asked recently by a multinational business based in Belgium to act as an advisor on ethics of new digital inventions that they might want to invest in. They want to make sure they're not investing in unethical technology. So I think there's a positive here. I just think we need to work on it, and we're still at really early days with all of this stuff, and it's kind of the Wild West out there, and I'm just a big advocate of making it less wild.
Yeah. Where would you see, I guess, more restrictions? Like if you had to put a pin on more restrictions, where would you see that? Would that be with website companies? Would that be with utilizing algorithms in a sense, or trying to find a way that, because I feel like the best way to introduce it, I should say, is something that the public really doesn't see. Like if you're going to have fully autonomous vehicles or vehicles that drive themselves, have them deliver pick up the trash, have them do mail delivery or something like that. Not that's influencing people's actual driving to work positions and it holds a person inside of it to get them to work like Uber or something. You got to introduce them slowly by starting off way out of their realm of their everyday life and then slowly coming into it. Because I think the more, I guess, advantages that we could see would be environmental issues, energy issues, probably a lot when it comes to minimizing the amount of energy you use in your home as well too, and then also maybe protection services when it comes to cybersecurity. But I see the people who get it first are the ones that make those websites and make those companies, where I think that should be the first issue that should be tackled.
Yeah, that's an issue in ethics called distributive justice. Who gets the goodies, right? And that's one of the big issues I bring up when I talk and write about technology is that there has to be some agency or some way to guarantee that not just the rich get all the benefits of advanced technology, because that'll lead to a really bad state of things in the future where the rich get much richer and much more powerful, and the inequities that we have today will become amplified. So, I think distributive justice is something important to pay attention to. So how do we do that? Well, you know, one obvious way is to have governments subsidize technology for the poor. Now, Americans don't like government subsidies. They don't like government regulation and so forth. But there are other ways to do it. You know, you could have a third party agency that sort of monitors distribution of things, or you could have a regulation on sort of an oversight of businesses that sort of checks now and then to make sure that they're not sort of skewing things that they invent. We already do that to some extent. I mean, businesses are always being monitored in various ways. So I think we need to do it for AI as well.
Don't you think it's going to leak over to what we're kind of doing now when it comes to like weapon systems? Like a lot of our weapon systems in the United States happen to be run by, I wouldn't say fully autonomous or fully AI, but most of it is AI. I mean, now wars aren't really fought with actual bullets and all that really anymore. A lot of it happens to do with cyber warfare as well, too. I mean, it's a whole other field, and that was introduced with technology. I mean, you introduce AI to anything, what are the battlefield's going to change? The whole thing's landscape.
That's already possible. I mean, I've been talking about that for about the last 10 years.
Whoa, 10 years. Hang on a sec. I was just tossing out like a hypothetical of where we're at now. Not, I didn't know it was 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, they already have uh, the Pentagon or DARPA specifically, the research arm of the defense of the Department of Defense called DARPA. They do a lot of advanced technology. They're the ones that came up with what's called the Batwing. The stealth fighters and stuff, and they were developing those way ahead of before anybody knew that they existed. There, here's some examples of stuff that already exists that's AI driven and autonomous in terms of weaponry. On the South Korean North Korea border, there are machine guns that are automated. Right now, there's a human in the loop, but what happens is if that machine gun, which is autonomous, detects an intruder in no man's land, it issues a challenge via robotic voice to put up your hands and drop your weapon. If the person doesn't do it, the person who is alarmed back at the border can choose to fire and kill, right? The thing that a lot of people don't know about that automated machine gun system is it can be put on fully autonomous, where it makes a decision whether or not to fire and kill. So that system is more than a decade old. Also, there were South Africa, this is about 15 years ago, tried out some fully autonomous anti-aircraft weapons. Unfortunately, the AI running it didn't work properly, and it swung around and killed a bunch of friendlies, a bunch of soldiers from their own side. So this stuff gets into the news, and that's how people find out about it. So anyway, there's already fully autonomous possibilities. The DARPA had been DoD has been researching autonomous robotic soldiers. Why? Because if you can make a robot that fights as a soldier, then you don't, and none of our humans get killed, which sounds great. I mean, but what happens is the same thing that happened with our drones, which is that the enemy captures one, reverse engineers it, and makes their own robotic soldiers. So you only have an advantage for maybe a year or two before suddenly everything's equal again. Plus, the big problem with robotic soldiers is that they're not able to distinguish sufficiently between an enemy and a friendly, or a civilian. So right now, there's too much chance they would kill civilians. But so the Pentagon has promised about 3 or 4 years ago, promised that they would not continue developing robotic autonomous soldiers. So that's just voluntary, though. And who's to say China won't do that, or Russia or somebody else with pretty good AI capabilities. So anyway, that's already on the board right now. um, there's already a lot of technology being used in the Ukraine war in Ukraine, for instance. I'm sure you know about the Turkish drones that can um, bomb things, but there's always a human in the loop. Something a lot of people don't know is that our drones, the Reaper drones and so forth, those can be made fully autonomous pretty easily. They're just not, because again, there's no way to make sure that the robot would pick the right target and kill the right target. We already have problems with that. And so they don't make them fully autonomous, although they could. So, we already have stuff like that. In the future, there's a there's a TED talk about this. One computer scientist does a demonstration. It's virtual, where he launches little robots about this big that can fly, and they have a little bomb attached on the inside of them. And all they do is home in on an enemy soldier, hit him in the head, and blow up, blows his head off. So just a swarm, it's called a robot swarm. A little swarm of those being released could kill a ton of enemy soldiers.
Is that Jim's TED Talk? Jim Giordana? I'm
I
gonna
can't
blank on his.
remember.
I'm pretty sure
Um,
I had him on the show because he was talking about weaponized military aerosol type little drones. See, that's what scares me though, is that even we say that there's like this line, but who's to say China's not going to do it? Now, in your position, I would look at the best way to ethically make sure you're doing things right is to do the exact opposite of what China and all that does. But see, the issue starts to become is when you analyze our government compared to their government, they're looking at a way that's supposed to be 100% functional and more beneficial to the production of their society. That's, what runs an effective machine. That means you have to take out human emotion. You have to take out all these things. I'm not talking about the equipment. I'm just saying that's how they look at how to run a country. We're a little bit different because we have like freedom, we have all this type of stuff that keeps into people's heads that they like to tweet out on Twitter to say you can't take my rights and all this type of stuff. That's great, but we have emotion too when it comes to empathy of losing a family member and losing all this. The issue starts to become is that if we fully weaponize our wars when it comes to fully autonomous machines, when we fix that little bug of having a person in the loop and we take the person out, then you can expense war whenever you want. You can start having just robots battle each other. All it does is cost money. It doesn't cost people's lives, which is going to make it a little bit more appealing. I'm just curious of how to make sure that that doesn't get seeded into our mind. I would be much prefer that if we just brought the AIs or the robots or whatever you want to say out of the war part and more into our homes or our lives. I'm more comfortable with that because I know we're just going to expel them with war, but I have a fear of that as well too. What stops fully autonomous robots from taking over everyone's job or becoming a part of your thing, and then it brings into this weird standpoint where you have a kid who wants the companionship of their parents but now is bonded to a robot. I mean, this is where my mind starts going, is like, are we managing at scale the vast ideas that we have with the amount of problems that can come with it?
well, that's why I say we got to be vigilant. A big thing for me right now is to be trying to promote vigilance about what we create and how we use it. I mean, you're right about all those things. In fact, those have been raised by various experts and various people publishing on this, including me. You know, there's a good book called Wired for War by P.W. Singer, he talks a lot about autonomous weapons in that book, and he interviewed a whole lot of people from the military, high up in the military. And if you're interested, I get some of my information about what I just told you a minute ago from that book. It's about 6 or 7 years old now, so I'm sure we've even progressed from that. But we have robotic mules that carry packs, which is there's nothing wrong with those. They can't hurt anybody. But he talks a lot about robotic warriors, and so does Ronald Arkin in one of his research. He has a book called Governance of Autonomous of Lethal Autonomous Weapons, and you can see read a lot of it on the internet and Google Books, and he talks there about the things I was saying, and that yeah, you get fewer people killed in a war that's between robots if the people are not in the way. The problem with robots is they can't recognize humans, whether they're a threat or whether they're a civilian, and they just kill everything. And because the recognition systems aren't good enough yet. AI is very advanced in some ways and very behind in other ways. AI is good at doing some very specific things like voice recognition or facial recognition, which still has problems, but it's not good at general behavior. So this is why there's problems. And like, for instance, you talked about civilians being safer, or well, people being safer, war being easier. That's another problem. I think you mentioned that. If you have robotic warriors, then it's easier to go to war because you start thinking, well, there's not much at risk. So we don't want that to happen where war becomes easier and more common. So, all of this stuff comes up. And as far as bonding, that's already happening. So I have a robotic vacuum. I call it a RoboVac. It's a Roomba. I don't know. Maybe you have one.
I've
So we
stepped
have
on them
two.
plenty of times.
Yeah, we have two of them, right? So I see it as a tool because that's what it is. It's not smart. It's good at recognizing dirt and picking it up. But other people, and I've seen videos of this, you can find them on YouTube. They get attached to their robotic vacuums. They dress up their Roombas in costumes. They give the Roomba a day off because they feel so, thankful that it cleans their floor. Robots don't need a day off. They humanize these things. They also, I mean, so they get attached to them, like pets. People do that with cars all the time, which is a little more understandable because you're in the car, it becomes an extension of you. But I'll bet you have a name for your car.
Yeah, but the car doesn't go in your home and doesn't do all these things. See, this is where my issue starts to become in is I'm not really worried like I am. I mean, the fully autonomous weapons and other systems, that's a fear, sure. But the psychological impact that people adapt with their devices, consider lockdown, for instance, all these people stuck inside their homes. How many people were just talking to Alexa just to hear somebody's voice and didn't feel like calling someone who I don't know, calling a family member? They'll be more than happy just to talk to a machine that doesn't really give you the conversational flow back, but it just does things that you ask it to, which means when you go out into the world again, you start going, hey, what's the weather? And like, I don't know the weather, look it up yourself. And you're like, what did you just say? You start seeing the issues.
I don't think we're going to get rebellious robots until we have sentient robots, which is highly unlikely in the near future, according to all the computer scientists I've talked to.
They're lying.
Having an AI that is sort of has a general intelligence like humans have, and moreover becomes aware of its own existence like humans are, and therefore becomes sentient. That would cause huge ethical problems, and then people are, but too many people worry about that way too early, in my opinion. A good example of what I think is idiotic, worry about this is Europe. The European Union actually, somebody introduced a law over there um, to outline robot rights. Robots are tools like a hammer. Do I give a hammer rights? No. When if the robots become sentient somehow and self-aware, well, then we got to think about that. But most scientists say that's highly unlikely for about another couple 300 years because we don't We don't have the um, we don't have the technology yet. The silicon chips are already reaching their limit of use because you can only pack so many transistors on a silicon chip. So Moore's law, which says that the power of a computer's doubles every 19 months, is dependent on your being able to cram more and more transistors onto a silicon chip. So one of the problems is we need a new substance other than silicon. It's called a substrate. And there are possibilities that we're working with already, like molecular computing, quantum computing, and and even genetic computing. But those are all experimental still. And quantum computing, there's only, I think, two quantum computers, and they're very difficult to operate and very bulky. So anyway, it, plus, where are we going to get the energy for, if you had a sentient robot, you'd have to have a lot of energy to run that thing. And right now, we're having problems with that.
I agree with you on the sentient part, but what I look at is the way that we deliver consciousness, the way that we understand consciousness, and a lot of someone I've had on the show who studies consciousness talks about, and a lot of it does correlate with just the eyes, like looking at someone's eyes. And when you see someone's eyes and they're kind of open and they're awake, you see this person's conscious. This person has a consciousness. But when they're dead, you just know there's a piece of you that goes, oh, their consciousness is gone. There's like something that just leaves there. We could talk to that can be the spirit, whatever. I go, if you make Sophia the robot, she's got a face, she's got eyes, she's got a mouth. She can just be repeating words that someone's saying through a microphone. But to think that there aren't going to be robot rights in 5 years, whether we consider the sentience or that type of consciousness, people just like I don't know. It's just it's that way that we deliver that term consciousness. Now, a robot might not have its own artificial system, or it might be running off of a website. It might not have its own free thinking and free moralities and thoughts and emotions and all this, but it's just those facial features, that uncanny valley where you know this thing isn't a human, but it's something else. It's the way that we like to adopt to items. I mean, like we were talking about in the beginning, cars, we give them a name. Give a robot a name,
Yeah,
half
but
the
that
time
doesn't mean a car should have rights, does it? And,
a car doesn't have a face.
I mean, have you ever talked to any of those robots like Sophia and there are a bunch of them. I've talked to those robots. They're definitely, if you're an adult, if you're a child, you could be fooled by it into thinking it's like conscious. But if you're an adult, you know it's a robot. It moves like an animatron at Walt Disney World. It's definitely not going to fool anybody who's mature and somewhat intelligent.
You thinking, hold
Um,
on. You think in the society we're in today that there wouldn't be people that would, that's what I'm talking about, is those outliers, the ones that we can call, oh, those are like the nut jobs or whatever. Those people are the ones that, like in the European law that was passed, that wanted that robot to have rights. I'm thinking of those people. Is that going to end up being the majority? You get someone who, they had that real doll for a while. Remember that? The
well, like you
lifelike
said,
robot?
those are nut jobs. They're fringe elements. So no, I don't think so. I think children are fooled. Well, actually, so robots, there have been a bunch of studies with robots to teach children things, especially things that are repetitive. Um, for instance, working with autistic children to get them to make eye contact. Autistic people on the autism spectrum have trouble making eye contact. It's just part of the thing that they have. So one of the uses of a robot called NAO was to repeatedly, to talk to an autistic child and repeatedly remind it to look it in the eye. And it can tell when it's it has a visual connect because it has cameras there, so and sensors. So a human doing that for a human tutor to do that is very boring and repetitive and difficult. But for a robot, they never get tired of that. So plus, they found that autistic kids have an easier time forming a connection with a humanoid robot than they do with other humans. For what reason? Not sure. The articles I read weren't able to figure that out, but for whatever reason, that's the case. So they like robots and they work well with them. So in that case, a humanoid robot is great, and the kids whether they see it as a real person or not doesn't really matter. Children are pretty have a pretty thin line or veil between what's real and what's imaginary until they're about 6 years old. So, you know, they could be convinced by robots. And yeah, that's a problem that's been talked about in there's a book called Robot Ethics, edited by Patrick Lynn and a few other people. All the articles in there are really good. One of them's a psychology article about getting attached to robots and how people doing the kids especially that can happen. And one of the problems that you kind of alluded to ethically is, what if the people that make the robot, the company that makes it, knows you're going to get attached to it in some way, and so they have a timing thing where once the robot's been active for say 6 months and they estimate you have formed a tie to it emotionally, it then starts suggesting you buy more stuff from the company. That makes you very vulnerable to being manipulated um, into buying things if you have an attachment to the robot that's telling you to buy stuff. And that's certainly something that could happen.
Well, we're
Um,
like that now. We're attached to our phones and devices, and they don't even have a face on it, and they don't even really talk to it. Like, anytime, like advertisements had it best, they would make something that was relatable. A mother who was working all day and trying to put food on the table, and she opens up mac and cheese, and then everyone's like, "Oh, I gotta go buy mac and cheese." It's about making it relatable, but the issue starts to become is like we're entering now where you have people that are interacting, and kind of where my focus has been on social bots, these bots that are on there, and you can call them Russian troll farms, whatever. That study came out saying that there was a large amount of propaganda on the internet, but it's just people not being able to decipher what's real. It's that losing that connection aspect. And I think that comes with isolation. I think that comes with the lack of communication that we funneled into our devices, where eventually, if someone gets a robot for their house, much like the people we talk about talking to their Roomba, that's going to translate over when people realize, oh, people like talking to their Alexa a lot. People like talking to their Roomba a lot. I'm not talking about now. I'm talking about 10 years from now when technology, people start going, let's put a face on the Roomba. They can dress your
yeah,
dog up like a Roomba. Then you'd be
yeah.
like, oh, I'm more comfortable with this robot dog that just cleans up all the food. And then you talk to it, you give it a little puppy dog voice, and then it's just going to only evolve from there.
Well, I think that stuff's already happening. I mean, Sophia's a good example. If you had a robot,
You're scared me, bro. You're
if
scared
robots
me.
like her were cheap enough, um, there'd be a lot more of them, and everybody'd have one in the house. And there are already people who form these imaginary attachments to robots or blow up dolls. I mean, if you look on trolled through the news, um, in the New York Times last week, there was a front page article about people who marry humanoid robots of the opposite sex. These people tend to be in Japan because Japan has a lot more humanoid robots. And the article was about these people defending their marriage to a non-human entity. So people do this stuff, but it's not the norm. Like you mentioned before, these are outliers. So I mean, anything can happen. But the key thing I think I want to go back to is how vulnerable are people to um, manipulation. If companies can lower your defenses to manipulation, then it becomes an unfair manipulation. You probably know about the famous instance of subconscious manipulation that happened way back in the 60s when movie companies realized that if they flashed pictures of Coca-Cola that only lasted half a second, you didn't consciously see it, but you unconsciously would get a desire to go get a Coke. That was outlawed because it's manipulation that you have no defense against. You're incredibly vulnerable to subconscious suggestion. Well, they could use that and embed that kind of thing in robotics technology as well. This is why we have to be careful. And I think society needs to monitor this kind of stuff.
Well, that's like the biggest issue with censorship as well, too. They have algorithms and bots now, like for YouTube. for me to post up a video like on my channel, I have a couple videos that are hour-long podcasts, but they go 5 minutes because it directs you to Spotify. Because the censorship, if you mention the word vaccine or mask or anything that's not fitting the narrative, your video gets flagged, which creates self-censorship, and people start it skews your thoughts. It makes you want to self-censor your speech because you're afraid to say this because you want your video to go up on the channel. And I don't like that because as much as it is to build up that wall of self-censorship, it's really hard to tear that back down. It's like building a bad habit. It's harder to break it once you form that type of thing. And it's like the way that they say it, I don't like their stance point on it of like it's not against your free speech, it's our platforms. It's like, yeah, but you're a lot bigger than what you think. Like these devices that used to be a luxury, your phone, your, Zoom, all these types of things started to become a requirement during lockdown. And then that's where the grasp of power starts to play, where it's like, you got to make sure that these companies aren't abusing people's kind of rights without them knowing that it's their rights as well, too. And if we talk about the outliers, for instance, the people in Japan, they're outliers. How long until that becomes the normal? I mean, there's a lot of things 5 years ago that sounded nuts if you said them out loud that we're doing today. And it's like, it's the way that times change. It's the way the shift starts to happen. It's the way these things slowly start to become more influenced into our lives. It's like a sense of programming in a sense. I mean, it's a lot of fears.
Well, I mean, I'd say two things. First of all, I know it's inconvenient to have to monitor certain words that you use, but better that than allow open propaganda to just run rampant on YouTube, which is the other possibility. I mean, you could have Hitler fanatics on YouTube saying whatever they wanted to convince people to become Nazis. If you didn't have some sort of
That's still on there. You could still do that. Just the pandemic's been censored.
censoring particular words by algorithm is supposed to prevent that, which I personally think is a good thing. The other thing is a lot of Americans misunderstand the laws about free speech. The government can't censor free speech, but that only relates to government actions and government property. When you're on private property, that the owner of that property can do anything they want. They can prohibit any kind of speech they want, and they can prohibit you from carrying a gun into a bar, for instance. In states where there are open carry laws, bars can still say you're not allowed in here with a gun because they're private property. It's harder, so basically the constitutional right to free speech, the constitutional to not be censored, has to do with government and individual interaction, not with anything else. So a lot of Americans say, on an airplane, say, you can't make me wear a mask. That's the infringement of my rights. It's not, because a plane is a private property owned by the company that, like Delta Airlines. So they can tell you whatever they want on their property. They're kings up in the air. But a lot of Americans think that free speech is limitless in the United States. It's not really.
But you
You
can't
can't
you
yell
can't
fire in a crowded theater.
yeah, you can't call violence onto destroying a government establishment, like anything that incites violence against the Constitution or anything like that either. But
And you
I,
can't threaten the president of the United States.
yeah, but you'll have open propaganda on one side when it comes to getting a shot, but then you can't say anything that goes against that. Like that's there's nothing of that deters against government. I mean, that's my example doesn't apply to that.
but I think it protects us all. I think the problem was I keep using the Wild West, you know, simile here, but it's better to have a marshal in town, and the marshal tells people leave their guns, at the station when they go to the bars and stuff. Better to have that than just everybody coming into town and doing whatever they want. So I mean, that's always been part of our history to say, all right, there are limits to things. Unfortunately, on social media, we haven't gotten to that point yet. Not yet. People are the social media is starting to put some limits on, but only because I think they're being threatened. Um, their business is being threatened. People are dropping off of Facebook. People are stopping off of Twitter. They're losing money. So now they're starting to put up some limits. So, money talks, I guess.
I think like Facebook is just extending out. Facebook just applied for podcasts and now they're taking it off only after a couple of months of doing it. They were making it so you would get more, I guess, access to viewers, but they said no, it's too much for us. People weren't really liking that because people already built up a reputation with the brands they trusted. They have the apps like Spotify, YouTube that they go towards for the podcast and things. Also, Facebook's doing dating. I mean, if you, I have huge issues with the Facebook algorithm on so many standpoints, but I think it's just because they're trying too hard to be like how what Disney does, where Disney seems to have a hand in everything. You know, these corporations want to be the only ones. Google is the best example. Google owns so much, but did anybody, that little Google car, you remember the Google car scandal that happened in like 2007? It was to make Google Maps to show you where to go. Well, they didn't know, but they got a $25,000 fine, which is way low compared to what they did. But it was sucking up Wi-Fi data from everybody's home, so it was stealing everybody's private information off their Wi-Fi network, like so like they do normally. Where I go, this is stuff where okay, my thought is, and you can call it conspiracy, sure, we'll go with that. But I go, if you already do it at a low rate already through people's web browsers, and now you just tried it and made a mistake and found out you just got fined $25,000 to do a more effective way in one giant swoop, you're going to try and find a way to do that again, but without
Of
getting
course,
caught.
because data is money for Google, and that's how they make their money, is scraping data and in using it, or especially for advertising. But here's another example. You ever heard of Jaron Lanier? He's a pretty famous programmer, computer scientist from Silicon Valley, and he also has written a bunch of books because he's kind of an anti-technology technologist, which is kind of weird. But he pointed out that a good solution would be for Google to pay a fraction of a fraction of a penny to anybody whose data is used in any way, and just send checks to the public. Basically, um, the way this is already being done in Alaska. Alaskans all get paid from 500 to a couple multiple thousands of dollars a year because of oil companies. Oil companies use the land to drill for oil, and the Alaskan legislature said, all right, well, the people here own that land. They're going to get paid by you, every single one of them. So at the end of every year, they calculate how much oil that's been taken out of the ground, how much the companies owe as a fraction of that money that they made. They send it to the government. The government distributes it evenly to every person in Alaska, and they get paid for the use of their land. So we could do the same thing for use of data. I like that idea. And um, because Google often uses other people's tools, like a lot of programmers put stuff up on websites that are open, sort of open source websites, and they're little applets that help other programmers build bigger programs. Those are usually used for free by Google to build their programs. I think those programmers should be paid. They're never paid. Here's another example, and again, this is from Jaron Lanier. The way Google Translate works is that it hears what you say, or you type in a sentence in English, and to translate it to Spanish, it scrapes data off of the web that's put up there by human translators, and it uses that for free to do the translation. So basically, they made a tool on the backs of people who make a living doing translation without paying them. And they do that all the time. Like I think you pointed to that. Google is in the in the business of just taking stuff for free off the web or from your data, because nobody's made a rule that they can't,
Well, that
except for that one instance where they got fined.
Well, that's my fears. I'm not really worried about the government. I'm more worried about corporations, but I also see the government's hand in it because the only way the government can really do anything about it is if they put restriction on these companies or they find ways to work with these companies to keep them all under an umbrella of this is the guidelines you have to go by. But then how long until you're like, well, that's a pretty good thing you just did. Can you teach us how to do that? And then it becomes this back and forth where you start running into ethical issues that I don't think people are really being aware of anymore. I mean, the metaverse, for instance.
Yeah.
That
Well, I mean, let's
brings
go
up a
back to
host of
Alaska.
problems.
They managed to do it, and they're a state government. They managed to do something really
There's like
good.
100 people in that state. It's not that hard to just pay a couple hundred people to ravage your. It was in the Simpsons movie. They showed it. That's how I knew what you were talking about. When they moved to Alaska, he paid them $4,000, and they were only there for a couple months or whatever. But that's the thing, is that you have Google is like they don't. It's not allowed in China. That should be your first, like, what? Like, because of there's a lot of issues that China sees with Google when it comes to, I think they have the same mindset that China does. I'm not saying Google's like this evil corporation, even though they say do no evil on their website, but it's about a profit thing. And see, the issue starts to become is that we look at, like, me and you look at it like, because we're the humans down on the floor, we're like, this is how, we want to treat other people, we want to be good for other people. But a giant corporation who doesn't know all these billions of people that use their platform, it's really hard for them to care about things that they don't know.
Of course, they don't
Yeah.
care. The thing I'm advocating isn't slowing Google down or putting restrictions on them. That's pretty much impossible anyway. They're so sprawling.
Yeah.
I'm advocating that they pay us for stuff that they
I'm with
take,
you.
right? So that's not that hard. I used an example of Alaska, but there are other examples too. It,
But
and
you're asking Google to
they
give you
can
money.
easily track what they take because they track everything. I'm just, fair in fairness, we should be paid for our work, right? And we should be paid for our personal data. Now, Google would argue probably, well, you are paid for your personal data. Robbie's data, you trade that. In return, you get access to Google. But I don't think it's an even trade.
That's what I'm saying, but here's the point I'm talking about. How do you get a corporation to feel like they need to pay you? That's like, it seems like you're asking for too much, but
You
really
make a
you're
law.
asking. But okay, but I don't know how that manages though without a corporation and that leaking into other corporations wanting to fight against that. You know what I mean?
Well, you, when you do work, day-to-day work for any corporation, they have to pay you because it's a law. You can't be you can't be made to work for free. I mean, I used to work restaurant jobs when I was young, and restaurants back then were notorious for trying to get you to work for free. Like they would make you skip breaks, right? Or they would have you work overtime but not pay you more for overtime. And it's because, you know, there were no real oversight of that stuff. It was hard to track. It was small peanuts. But you know, but then restaurants got sued and retroactively for that, and were forced to pay back their employees for all that time they worked for free. So we already have laws that do that. So we can institute another law for being paid for data that's yours. It'd be pretty easy, and they can certainly track it with the algorithms they have. They don't want to, but they could be made to do it. This is the kind of stuff, I think there's some creative thinking that needs to come up when people say, but you can't do that. It's usually because they don't think about the fact that we already do that stuff in other ways with other situations in corporations and stuff. So I think, I don't think regulation of certain types is unreasonable or undoable. Um,
What would you say would be the steps that you thought of in your own perspective to, at least from the work that you do, or at least the research that you, because you're definitely knowledgeable in a lot of this stuff. Where do you think the direction would be some crucial steps that we could be implementing to be able to make sure that these things do go in the right direction? I mean, not even talking about AI, just maybe even corporations, for instance. That's a big issue I feel like a lot of people are struggling with right now. It's the whole reason why Elon bought Twitter.
yeah. Well, for one thing, this morning in the Wall Street Journal, there was an article pointing out that Tesla's investors are not happy that Musk bought Twitter or is buying Twitter because they're worried that he's going to split his attention away from Tesla now, and they're starting to punish the stock by driving the price down. So there are consequences for everything. But to go to what I think should happen is with intelligent technology in general, including stuff that's implanted in your body, um, stuff that's made for anything that's AI driven or is even intelligent technology. we should have a system of regulation like we do already, just to imitate what we do for other types of work and other types of um, products. So, uh, and there's three tiers, right? There's the private personal tier. At that level, at the personal level, people who invent things should think about the consequences of what they're making. Just because you can do something, that doesn't mean you should do something. Like, if you can invent a bigger bomb, does that mean you should? Well, maybe not. So anyway, a personal set of ethics, but then beyond that, um, ethics that are run by oversight bodies that are business bodies. Like, there are sort of entities that oversee a certain type of corporation, and they're like clubs, and in order to be a member of that club, you have to obey these rules and regulations. But then there's also what works best are regulating bodies like the FAA for aircraft, and um, Underwriters Laboratory for electronics, or the NIST that I mentioned earlier for technology products. I mean, they set standards and you have to obey them. If you're a corporation, you can't make Underwriters Laboratory won't pass a new electrical device that doesn't pass safety tests. I think they should have something like that for AI as well. And it could be the same, regulating body. You could have a branch of, say, Underwriters Laboratory that work with AI to make sure they were safe. And then the last thing is having some to control creation of dangerous AI. I think a good suggestion was made by Nick Bostrom, who's a philosopher over at Oxford and runs um, you know, a whole sort of think tank about this kind of stuff. He wrote a really important article a couple years ago called "The Vulnerable World Hypothesis," and in there he suggests that AI should be regulated by a body that controls not the output of the product, but controls the materials going into the product, so that you can't even make a dangerous device without a license, right? So that would keep the advantage of keeping a rogue operator, somebody just down the street who's a genius from making something dangerous. Also, it would stop rogue states, at least somewhat, from, like China, from making dangerous AI because they wouldn't be able to get the materials to do it. I think that's a pretty good suggestion.
I think taking out the weaponization of most aspects of products that are being created are probably good. If we talk about organizations or groups that could be created to oversight or manage, I guess, at scale, a lot of these companies, I don't know if that should be a government entity that owns that. I don't also think it should be researchers that do it as well, too, because I can show you plenty of studies where researchers have been influenced by corporations, and I can show you plenty of governments that have been influenced by corporations.
Yeah, sure.
It's hard to be like, well, then give the voice to the people, because then it's like, well, people are fucking nuts sometimes, so it's hard to get them to go and do the right thing a lot of times. Where I start going, what's the best aspects? And I think that vulnerable world hypothesis one, if you really look at an aspect of taking that into organizations, imagine putting in people that have varying differences and opinions and different aspects that are complete polar opposites in a sense, and having them sit down at a table to manage. Some people are going to say, well, this is 100, just like how me and you have different ideas of censorship, for instance. That's good in a conversation, and it helps us come down to an agreement on one thing where we meet a happy middle. You know what I mean? It's not necessarily a whole bunch of people that agree and can be influenced with money.
Well, I think you're right in the sense that the big difficulty for making sure that AI is safe, for instance, is not going to be using regulatory bodies, let's say in the United States, because we're a particular culture here, and we have already certain regulatory bodies like Underwriters Laboratory, which we could use for regulating AI as well. And we have the cultural value of doing that. China does not. China, it has a whole different culture, especially political culture, and they will naturally be much less likely and willing to 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 engage in a, say, a global um, some kind of global regulation of AI, because for them, they don't care. I mean, they want to they think it's to their advantage to have weaponized AI. This is the same problem we have with regulating atomic weapons worldwide. Different cultures have different sets of values, and they have different reasons for wanting, say, nuclear weapons. Pakistan thinks it's existentially necessary for them to have nuclear weapons, even if they manage to blow them up by accident and kill all themselves, because it's a guarantee for them that India won't attack. And, the United States feels the same way about Russia. We have nuclear weapons because if Russia knows we're going to attack them, if they attack us, we have mutually assured destruction, and it'll keep us both from launching those weapons. It's come to that because we weren't good at limiting distribution of that knowledge early on in atomic energy, because people are vulnerable and not perfect, and spies stole stuff. And this is a bit what you're getting at, really, is basically people aren't perfect. So none of our solutions are going to be perfect either, you know, but we got to try.
Yeah, see, I even look at that like because when we talk about like even though we have a nuclear treaty ban, we have a bioweapons ban too. So I came across this on accident just looking into biolabs. I came across old biolabs called Vigo Ordnance Plant. Now, it was sold in, I think, around the 70s or something when there was a bioweapons ban, but it was registered in the 40s to make weapons. Britain actually hired them to make anthrax bombs. You know who they sold the lab to?
I don't
Just
know
take a
who.
shot in the dark. They've been the biggest medical company so far that's been in sponsoring the news.
AstraZeneca.
No, it's Pfizer. So Pfizer bought the bioweapons lab in the 70s and they sold it in 2008. And there was 8,000 pounds of anthrax that was still at that lab. Now, someone brought up the point that it's simulant to be able to detect bioweapons. I go, yeah, but you can do your research anywhere. Why did you have to buy a old American United States government bioweapons lab? I just say this is the thing is that necessarily the United States government goes, we're not in bioweapons, but then they just subsidize to another company. It's the same thing that politicians do when they put their money somewhere. They just put it in a bunch of different companies. I don't expect that to go away ever. So whenever we say these regulations start to happen, I go, they're just going to find a way that their name isn't attached to it. And then I also worry about the exposure of people. We talk about Japan with them dating these robots and AIs. I go, yeah, but how long until they eventually that comes here? See, the thing is, the way that
Oh, it's already here, but
yeah,
Americans just aren't as interested. The
now wait 10
Japanese
years.
have an interesting culture. They've always been much more much more interested in cartoons and virtual reality and robots than Americans in a personal way. So, and part of it is the way that culture works. So our culture isn't as interested in having relationships with humanoid robots as Japanese people are. When I've followed the various types of humanoid robots they've made over there. Some are really amazing. They only sell them in Japan because they sell like that and they don't have enough for America. But also Americans just aren't as interested. There are some who are. I mean, um, Martine Rothblatt. I don't know. Do you know who she is? She's the one who invented the geoposition satellites that uh, that allow us to do satellite TV and so forth. She became a multi-millionaire because of that, and she's now her wife, Bina. She made a robot of her. It looks, it's a humanoid robot like Sophia. I had a discussion with that robot a couple of years ago. Uh, Not really realistic for me, but not bad. And so Martine Rothblatt's very interested in humanoid robots, but that's an exception in the United States. So I I'm trying to I guess what I'm trying to point out is that different cultures are going to have different interests and different habits, and we're going to have trouble coming to a meeting of the minds around the world with anything that is potentially dangerous. But we got to try,
Yeah.
and better than not doing anything at all.
I just think the more it becomes normalized into your everyday life, the more you kind of just accept it and forget about the issues you had with it in the first place. I mean, that's where I see Japan's culture.
I think that's the case with these things. I
Yeah.
mean, this I when I when I go up into the mountains, we my in-laws have a cabin in the mountains in the Sierra Nevadas and Lake Tahoe area. When I go up there, uh, I get just enough reception to make a phone call, nothing else. And I feel like my arm has been taken off. I can't surf the web. I can't um, I can't use FaceTime. I can't do anything like that. I can only send texts and make a phone call. And so I'm so used, I'm sure you are too. I'm so used to being able to look stuff up, you know. This is like an extension of my memory and an extension of my brain because I use it as a cognitive support device to help me remember things and help me look up stuff to make me sound smarter. I actually do that in conferences. I take the phone, I put it beneath my desk. This is in conferences of like, say, 20 people or more, where they won't notice. And I'll be thinking of, like I was talking about Jaron Lanier earlier. I was remembering that. But at a conference, if I couldn't remember his name, I simply look down and type it up into Google, have it come back, and I say, Jaron Lanier said,
Yeah.
you know, and then people think I'm smarter. But I'm really dependent on this thing.
Yeah. Most people are. This is the thing. Like when you mentioned in the beginning about Aristotle talking about artificial intelligence, do you just think people have always just wanted something that would be, in a sense, more superior than them, but also be in control, be, I guess, controlled by them? Like,
Yes,
okay,
this is the theme of my first book, Artificial Slaves. People
good question. Hooray.
people want there's an archetypal need for people all the way back into the darkness of time to want to have somebody to do their crummy work for them, work they don't want to do, and they want whatever that is, a slave or a device, to be better at it than they are so that they can get it done faster and better. So what Aristotle thinks about in his in his book called Politics. It's called Politics, but he talks about slavery a lot. So he's talking about slavery and how it's problematic even for the Athenians to own slaves because some Athenians felt like it was wrong to own a human being. And he said, well, what would work great is if we could figure out somehow how to animate tools so that they could, like a weaving loom, could know what you want and make it without any kind of human intervention. So it could weave by itself, and a guitar, or he talked about a lute, could play by itself and make music. So he's talking about essentially robotic devices, artificial intelligence. He couldn't say that. He thinks of it as sort of a magical thing. But the whole reason he's thinking about it in the first place is because it's to replace slaves. And he wants all of the people who think about those kinds of devices through history always imagine them as sort of superhuman without thinking about the fact that if they're superhuman, they might destroy us because they're better than us. If you make something that's stronger and better than you, then you've made a competitor for yourself. And that's what the other half of the thesis of the book is that a lot of the stories about robots and proto-robots through history have been about their danger and about their promise, both. And that's what I talk about mostly. I think AI has a lot of promise, but it has a lot of dangers, and we got to be careful about it.
Do you think that humans or just people in general will be so blinded by their wantingness of being able to have something that does work for them easier that they would miss all the possible dangers of what it would be? Like,
Absolutely.
okay,
I mean, absolutely.
I'm with you.
Uh,
I
Look at
always I always talked about with
this
yeah, well,
can be dangerous.
I talked about with biomechanical engineers where they're talking about giving like someone who doesn't have lower part of their legs being able to use machines as that. And I go, when you make that knowledge known to the public that you have the technology to do so, what stops someone from wanting to blow off their own legs to be able to get that? And they go, that's crazy. I go, I know 100 people that would light themselves on fire or get in a car accident just to be able to have robotic legs, because now you've given that person more of an advantage than that person feels like they have with their own natural ones. That's just human. That's just, we talk about, okay, those are the outliers. Man, it's more people than you think. Some people go, I would like a robot eye. I would like a robot ear. I would like all this type of stuff. This is, people want to make themselves at a higher level than others. They've always wanted to do that throughout history. And if that's through a device, if that's through whatever, that's the way that they're going to obtain that. People just want to feel like they're better in so many aspects.
Okay, so um,
You Googled on me too.
I
Why?
did Google because I wanted to show you there are people like that. You see this guy,
Yes,
Neil
I
Har
talk about him all the time.
Neil Harbison. He's a guy. He's one of many of what are called biohackers. If you Google biohacker or biohackers now, you'll see a lot of people like him who've modified their body in kind of weird ways with technology, like putting in fake eyes, like embedding stuff that
They're
could be pretty
cyborg race.
painful. And there are people who would do that. There's also a science fiction story. There's a famous short story about that, about people who purposely mutilate themselves because they like the attention, first of all, but also because they want false body parts that are actually better than the ones they have. Now, to have this actually happen, you'd have to have a future where, you know, biotechnology, like a fake leg, was actually way better than a human one. Because this was an issue. You remember in the Olympics when that guy, the Blade Runner, ran. He had two false legs. Do you remember this? Is about 10 years ago, and they were had titanium or some other high carbon blades that he ran on to replace his feet. And he'd been that way since birth, so he was used to this. And the athletes in the Olympics did not want him to run because they thought his legs, his feet, would generate more energy than they could match with a regular leg. So they thought it was cheating. And then they only relented when he got worse times than they did in the trials. And they thought, well, he's not that fast, so he's okay. So he ran in the Olympics with two fake legs from the knee down with these blades that were made of carbon. And
He's
it
still
was
got on a Wheaties box, so I don't know what the issue is.
right. What I'm saying is that people were frightened that his legs were better than their legs and
Yeah.
that no natural legs could be any better. So they, of course, don't want to cut off their legs because, yes, some people would do that. But those people, like you used to use your word, are outliers. That's a lot of pain, a lot of anguish, and a lot of learning to go through to use a false leg. I met a guy from England at a tech conference who had lost his hand in an industrial accident. And so he volunteered for an experimental hand that was controlled by AI and highly advanced. And the key thing that old prosthetic hands could not do is control the pressure with which they close the hand. If a lot of people would try these hands and they'd break glass or they squish something without meaning to, this guy could adjust that because it was very advanced and it tied into this muscles and nerves in his hand. So I bravely volunteered to shake his hand. He goes, "Go ahead, won't hurt you." And he managed to put just the right amount of pressure to shake my hand, but not break it. And still,
Hang
he
on,
would,
hang on. I bet you if you asked him, have you ever tried, you know what, with that, he would have said no. I wouldn't put any trust in a machine for that one.
yeah, well, I'm sure he wishes. I should have asked him, would you trade that hand for if you could get your real one back? He would. I'm sure he would have said, sure. Nothing's better than a real hand because you don't have all the connections yet. But if we ever get to that point where you can make an artificial hand that's just as good and just as sensitive as your regular hand, I'm sure there's some people who would replace it.
Like,
I mean,
that's where I see the benefit of it. But I think when technology gets good and then it keeps going and going and going, they only make it really appealing. And there's like we say, those outliers, there are people out there that'll be more than happy to be like, well, that seems like an advantage over the one that I have. Now, here's the
Well,
thing
Neil
is,
Harbison,
yeah,
he got that thing in his head because he was colorblind, and it gives him a way of seeing colors.
yeah.
And so, you know, for him, it's an improvement.
Well, these are just the bare models. Wait till they get like 10, 20 years down the line when they really excelled at being able to make it not noticeable like that, being able to just add an implant into your head.
There are guys who experiment with this stuff as a way of doing art or as scientists. The scientist that does a lot of this is named Kevin Warwick, Warwick, and he's an English computer scientist. He's famous for being the first guy to implant an RFID chip in his hand that would let him open doors
Yeah.
and stuff. You know about him?
Yeah, I know about him.
Yeah.
There was a story
So
about a guy trying to open up doors with a microchip in his hand. Yeah, I remember that.
that was a long time ago. But there's another guy who's an artist named Stellark. Have you heard of him?
Mm-mm.
Stellark is Australian. He's probably about 60 now, but he's famous for doing really radical implantations in his body. Like he implanted, he tried to implant in his arm um, a microphone that would be on 24/7, and then he connected it to the web, so anybody on the web at any time of day would be able to hear what he was saying or snoring or whatever, so that he'd be totally public as an artistic experiment. It didn't work because he got infected, but he's done things like hung himself by hooks
Oh,
from the ceiling, and I mean, some of it's really gross, but he's also done various implants that he takes out later, and then he makes an art spectacle of himself as a performance artist. He's very famous among technologists, and he goes to a lot of conferences to talk about his stuff. But if you Google him, Stellark, it's spelled Stelarc, and it's his professional name, not his real name. You'll see a whole bunch of YouTube videos of him, and take a look at him, because some of the stuff he does is radical. That kind of guy. He's a forerunner
yeah.
of what you're talking about.
Well, you given enough promotions to everybody else's links. How about you promote some of your own? I bet it's been a real pleasure chatting with you.
Oh, well, I talked about my two books already, and I do a lot of articles, publication in journals. I've done a few in popular things like USA Today, but other than that, I also give talks. I'm available to give talks publicly. I'm going to Germany in about 2 weeks to talk about this stuff and at a conference, and they're going to pay me to do it. Um, I'm not sure how you found me online.
I'll just Google, good old Google that I talk trash on for the past half hour of this show.
I'm curious, what terms did you use to find me?
Well, I talked to David Pierce, who taught Nick Bostrom, and he studies transhumanism and being able to, I, I guess, I forgot what he said, the word that he used about this chemical, this drug that you can take to raise this hermetic scale inside people's heads to make everyone not really experience pain. And when I talked to one person who's involved in transhumanism like that, I decided I got to go to the kind of ethics side of it as well too. And your name came up, and then apparently your co-author is another person I'm talking to as well too. I didn't know.
James Hughes?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's the co-editor of that book. Yeah, he's smart. He's a very smart guy, and also he runs that institute I'm a fellow of, the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technology. His specialty, that's fascinating, is religion and technology. He's a Buddhist monk.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he talks about, you know, artificial intelligence in Buddhist terms. What, like, for instance, one question he asked, one of his articles, is about the ethics of trying to make an intelligent, sentient robot in Buddhist terms. And basically, what he said, in Buddhist terms, it would be a bad thing because you're making a suffering being. Because if a robot is sentient like us, they can suffer, because that's how we suffer. We're self-aware, and we're aware of pain and anguish and emotional responsibility. And I thought that was a really clever take on the idea of sentient robots. So you can tell them I told you about that.
I will.
You, you and I are friends.
I couldn't pinpoint where you were at on the whole AI discussion. I've seen a lot of your works as well, like publications that you have on Google Scholar and all that. It's just I was like, is he this way or is he this way? But then when I saw you kind of related it more to like ancient things as well too, thought was interesting. But I like this discussion because I got really kind of your view of the ethics about it behind it.
Yeah, that's what I do is ethics of technology. And so I'm neither for nor against AI. I'm in the middle. I would like it to be used responsibly. I also want it to be developed. I was more on the let's go side 10 years ago, but then it's starting to get away from us. So now I'm more on the slightly skeptical side, saying, "Now wait a minute,
Yeah.
let's talk about this."
Yeah.
So that's where I stand.
I'm with you as well on that one. But it's been a pleasure chatting with you, man. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blind.